Hello, our group chose the global issue, the Syrian refugee crisis. My name's Peyton Grahovac.
My name is Evan Huang.
I'm Jimmy Schmidt.
And I'm Carly Olivas.
Over time, as globalization has increased throughout our world, there have been a major rise in globality. In the online document titled Global Transformations, David Helb referred to the term globalization as a process or set of processes which embody a transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions, generating transcontinental or interregional flows and networks of activity, interaction, and power. So, this widespread perception is based off the broadening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of life. This involves the cultural, political, religious, criminal, financial, and environmental aspects around the globe. Everyone should be able to feel safe and secure within their families and community while having the ability to freely express their culture and values. However, sometimes that is not the case. War, military force, and organized violence have become central to the globalization of human affairs for most of history. This result of globalization has caused uncontrollable vulnerability in some countries, such as the Syrian refugee crisis, the global issue our group chose. The disempowerment of Syria creates conflict within their social connections due to the lack of collaboration among other nations and their weakened dependent economy. These conflicts have led a crisis to break out within Syria. Thomas Friedman, a writer for the New York Times, has referred to Syria as a significantly half-flat country. This means that the Syrian people are exposed to the flat world, but are too disempowered and do not have the resources or tools to participate in this globalization process taking place. A key factor to success involving globalization is how cultures thrive through international relations and social connections. However, Syria is an example of not doing this. They are not exposed to these opportunities necessary for this collaboration to occur. The Syrian economy faces challenges of economic globalization, forcing them to become dependent on international organizations. Some of these organizations include the WTO, the IMF, the International Bank, the Syrian-European Partnership, and the Arab Free Trade Zone. This reliance has led to economic, cultural, political, and social chaos among the Syrian people and economy. As the Syrian refugee crisis continues to have an increasing effect around the world, it is vital to not ignore this major issue. We as global citizens must know what, why, and how these global issues came about and what we can do to make a difference. It may not affect us personally, but it does affect the world we live in. That may mean we make a difference in our local community at first. So we will now discuss the causes and possible solutions more in depth. It is important to understand the key aspects of this issue, the societal effects it has or are associated with it, the existing solutions, current or previously implemented or proposed, and the root causes of the issue. As a group, we'll be using peer-reviewed journals, web articles, and news articles found throughout the California State University Library database to gather the specifics regarding the Syrian refugee crisis.
The Syrian refugee crisis is the direct cause of the outbreak of violence and civil war in Syria. But what caused the outbreak of violence? What was the root cause of this crisis? The answer lies back in 2011. According to BBC News, as well as other news sources, the Syrian refugee crisis is the direct result of the pro-democracy protests that erupted in March 2011. in the southern city of Doria. After the arrest and torture of some teenagers who painted revolutionary slogans on the school wall. After security forces opened fire on demonstrators, killing several, more took to the streets. As a result of the shooting, the demonstrators even more protests erupted across the nation, demanding the resignation of President Assad in July of 2011. National security forces attempted to control the situation with violent tactics, but opposition supporters and civilians took up arms in order to defend themselves from the violent national security forces. Later on, many of the civilians turned on the national security forces in order to expel them from their regions, ultimately becoming more and more violent. Violence increased by late 2011 and into 2012. The original peaceful protest grew into an all-out civil war between opposition rebels and the government forces in 2012. By 2015, the United Nations estimated that an approximate 250,000 people had been killed. This image shows the UN's approximate death toll since the beginning of the conflict in Syria to 2015. During this time of turmoil, radical Islamic groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, have grown in power. They capitalized on the chaos and taken control of large swaths of Syria and Iraq. As we have learned in the past lesson, terrorist networks are truly global by nature and has a transnational reach. In 2014, the United States and Russia took actions with their military asset against the terrorist organizations by organizing airstrikes inside Syria. As a result of increasing violence due to civil war, terrorism, and intervention of foreign forces inside Syria, more than 4.5 million people have fled Syria since the start of the conflict, most of them women and children. The result of the conflict in Syria is a global crisis and a very global event in nature. Individuals seeking safety and escaping internal conflict of their own country soon became refugees as the conflict began. These refugees fled into neighboring Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, as well as other European countries such as Greece and Germany. This is a map showing some of the locations the refugees flee to. It can be noted that a majority of the refugees flee into neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan.
Musavian believes that there are three objectives we must overcome in order to solve the crisis in Syria. The first objective being what to do with President Bashar al-Assad and his refusal to resign. The Saudi-US-Turkey coalition believe that their focus should be to remove Assad from his position. Iran and Russia, however, believe that their priority is to rid Syria of terrorist organizations and then hold a free election monitored by the United Nations to decide the country's president and constitution. If focus is towards the removal of Assad, the possibility of the total collapse of the Syrian security military establishment could happen. Without this military force, the majority of the forces fighting terrorist organization in Syria would not exist, and there would be no one left to protect the country. Therefore, it should be a priority to get rid of the terrorist organizations in Syria to establish Syria's territorial integrity. To follow up, the United Nations should make it possible for refugees to return safely and allow the people to choose their leadership through a free and fair election with the new constitution that includes protections to all minorities. The second objective would be to figure out how to effectively fight terror groups occupying Syria. Deploying airstrikes would only be effective when conducted with a well-organized ground force. This is a problem because ground forces have conflicting allies. The largest ground force fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups is the Syrian army. The regional U.S. allies, however, have been fighting against the Syrian army. To form the necessary cooperation between air and ground forces, cooperation between NATO, the Syrian army, Russia, and Iran is essential. The third obstacle is the extremist movements and their ties to West allies. Extremist movements such as Al Qaeda and ISIS get their ideology and weapons from the West. Because ISIS is first and foremost an ideology and culture, the world will never be able to defeat them as long as Western allies promote their ideology. For example, between 1921 and 1991, the USSR spent over $7 billion on propagating their ideology worldwide. A majority of the refugees fleeing Syria flee to frontline states, and because they practice the open door policy, they take the most burden that comes along with accepting refugees. Therefore, financial and economical support should be provided to the frontline states through organizations such as the World Bank. Also, Sweden should be an example of what other countries should be doing. Institutions and local governments provide housing, jobs, and education to new refugees through private organizations and collaborating with nonprofit organizations. The government also offers a stipend to employers who employ refugees by utilizing LinkedIn to aid new arrivals with connections to jobs and internships.
The civilians in Syria have undergone the dangerous warfare that has created many consequences, resulting in both casualties and injured people. In regards to global citizenship, Obama has recently announced plans for the United States that will accept more refugees. This was a response from a letter he received from a young boy who wanted to bring an injured Syrian child into his home after watching his rescue online. This letter had Obama have a press conference about the ongoing Syrian issue and a serving reminder of what humanity is left in the world. Another implication was brought on by Pope Francis recently. He announced during his weekly audience that he wants a temporary ceasefire in Syria to allow its civilians and children to escape the violence. It is the strongest plea to the Syrian conflict. As globalization spreads throughout the globe, it has caused globality to rise within several countries, unfortunately resulting them to become fragile. One of these countries so happens to be Syria. It is based around a weak dependent economy with multiple internal and external conflicts such as the civil war, terrorism, and the US and Russian intervention. Syria is now considered disempowered with a few social connections due to the lack of collaboration among other nations. As the conflict in Syria worsened, many solutions had been proposed that can make a difference. These solutions include the United Nations taking control to try to eradicate the radical groups or removing the current president in order to bring in a new leader, focusing relief and support to the frontline countries, restore peace, give the Syrians back their unity and independence, and fight for their humanitarian rights. Hopefully, as we enforce these multiple solutions, the country of Syria can strengthen and eventually the refugee crisis will disappear altogether to put an end to this global issue.